Good morning, everyone. This is Penny from Wisconsin Land and Water. I'm the Conservation Training and Membership Services Manager there. And today our presentation is going to be How Did We Get Here? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our presenters. So today we have Perry Lindquist and Dan Masterpole. And Perry has worked in the land and water conservation field at the county level for 37 years. Actually, they both have worked at the county land conservations for 37 years. Kind of interesting. And Perry's first half of his career was in Washington County, and the second half in Waukesha County. So first half in Washington, second half in Waukesha. He says he has remained active in conservation program policy the entire time and has the scars to prove it. And Dan Masterpole has worked in the land and water conservation field as a county conservationist in Chippewa County for 37 years. He says he has been actively engaged in policy discussions along the way in a well-meaning attempt to improve local service delivery. So it's great to have these two. They have a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really excited to hear their presentation. And so I think we're about ready to start. So Perry, are you ready?
I am ready, if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Take it away.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Penny, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning on this beautiful Friday morning to listen to a couple old codgers talk about how it used to be back in the good old days. And just like Grandpa used to say, and I guess that's you and me, Dan, we're now grandpas in the conservation field as we pretty much are approaching the end of our careers. We have lived through some conservation programs, and we wanted to share some of that with you, and in the process engage you in some of the discussion. Okay, and of course now my controller isn't working. I was having laptop issues when I logged in this morning.
He has a backup, so if we need to, we'll switch over to that. And it was working just 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, I was working 2 minutes ago. This is what I was afraid of.
The anticipation builds. There you go.
Oh. I hope I don't have to do this all day. Anyways, the presentation is set up as a timeline. It's pretty much in chronological order, and we'll try to explain and along the way how they impact the county programs, major accomplishments, setbacks along the way. And then Dan will do a recap at the end of each decade or so with some thoughts on what the trends were through that past decade and some points to ponder. And then, like Penny said, we'll try to stop at a couple points and get some answered questions and get the group engaged. And a couple caveats as far as the presentation, it's not an all-inclusive history of our programs. There would be just way too much material to work. In fact, we tried to focus on the Nonpoint program, and even within that, more on the agricultural side of that, how these programs affect counties and our association. And last but not least, the subtitle, the fact that I say we're from the cheap seats, that's referring to the fact that we're at the county level and we have our own perspective on how things have evolved. So with that, Dan and I will be doing a tag team, and I'll pass it off to Dan right now.
Thank you, Perry and Penny, and thanks for everyone for carving out the time to tune in today. I want to first start by thanking Perry for doing a lot of the heavy lifting and compiling the history. He talked and really did try to pull together history that can be shared through time by others, and hopefully we can keep this up in the future. So the purpose of the presentation is to explain the history and to provide some context for those that are viewing to improve your understanding of our status of the programs today. And most importantly, maybe try to explain why things developed as they did. What were the major forces at play that affected the development of some of the history? And then to offer our to help you meet future challenges and to avoid the risk of repeating history. You know, the future belongs to the living, and part of what we wanted to do here is to provide you the background so you can do your jobs better. So this is a cartoon of an album cover from a recording artist named John Prine, who has recently passed away, from an album cover called Common Sense. And this shows a trusting rural youth stepping on a rake. And I think this is especially apropos, and because this trusting rural youth is about ready to experience discovery, and he's going to have to respond and react. So, you know, as you listen to this, we ask that you ask yourselves, you know, what have we been doing right that we should keep doing? What have we been doing that we should really stop doing? And what aren't we doing that we should start doing? In other words, we ask you to listen and ask yourself, you know, how we should change as we're moving forward. You know, for perspective, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, the environments where we live, and of course, you know that we use our land and water resource base to both produce and manufacture minerals, food, fuel, and fiber. So there's a old adage that if you don't, if you're going to manufacture it, you need to either mine it or grow it. And we have the responsibility as resource professionals to help manage that natural resource base with the landowners. So we're in a transition from soil and water conservation programming, which has historically been voluntary, to non-point pollution control, which is in reality regulatory. And in so doing, you know, we're trying to balance, you know, private property rights and responsibilities with community rights and responsibilities. And that's a very difficult balance. And you as resource professionals are living this reality. So I can't thank you enough for what you're doing as we're dealing with essential services, and for all you're doing as you're performing your duties. So for further perspective, things have changed, and they're going to continue to change over time. We're all transition players. We may not realize it, but time continues to pass. And the major variables that came to our mind as we were trying to put this presentation together is that the environmental issues have changed over time. Other things that are changing are the demographics and the social perspectives, market and economic forces, the extent or lack of extent of political support, the cooperating agencies themselves and the delivery systems, and the players. Perry, I'll pass it back to you.
So along the way, I'm going to be using the analogy of a conservation roller coaster, and you'll see what I mean as we get through the presentation. But we have these ups and downs, and where we're making progress, and then not so much. So stay tuned to that. So let's start out in the beginning. There were soil conservation districts, as everyone knows. It started in the Dust Bowl area, but around Wisconsin, it wasn't so much the Dust Bowl, maybe in the central part of the state, but It was more water erosion, in particular gully erosion in the southwest, that got a lot of attention. And we were, of course, the site of the first conservation projects in the state or in the nation. And this was about when NRCS was created. They used civilian conservation crews to complete a lot of the work. And it revolved around voluntary soil conservation associations at that time. In fact, while they were working on this pilot project, they were also developing a national institutional template for a national law for conservation districts. And in 1937, that was instituted in Wisconsin in Chapter 92, which hasn't changed. Or the position of it hasn't changed. The chapter has changed a lot. Originally set up as independent units of state government, governed by local elected bodies. 10 were created that year in western Wisconsin, and 8 of them were by watershed boundary. And I mentioned that watershed boundary because even though everybody understood the resource followed those watershed boundaries, they soon realized that the political support did not, and that followed political boundaries. And because of this fact, they ended up rewriting Chapter 92 or revising it so that it followed, conservation districts were required to follow county boundaries. And that really started the county connection at that time. They also connected the program to University Extension through a board of soil and water conservation districts. So they recognized the need for some statewide coordination of the program. And then by this time, you know, the 3-prong system of technical assistance, education, and financial services was pretty much set up through USDA agencies. By the 1950s, or 53 in particular, all districts had been formed in all Wisconsin counties. We formed our state association at that time, which was called WACD. And there was a renewed interest in that watershed scale of projects and flood control in particular, both at the state level and at the national level, which resulted in the national law PL 566. This went on for several decades, actually, through the 80s, where 87 dams were built, mostly in the western part of the state. The program was administered by SCS or NRCS, but there was already some, even at that time, some tension between the federal and state agencies on who should be calling the shots, so to speak, in some of these programs. And in fact, there was a 1956 proposal to modify Chapter 92 to retitle it the Soil Conservation and Watershed Management. This proposal did not pass, but that concept of our impacts on water quality carried through about 10 years later in the first county mandate that would come down from the state legislature, which required every county in the state to adopt shoreline and floodplain zoning ordinances. They were given a deadline of 1968, but this was actually done by 1971. And by the way, all this earlier stuff, obviously Dan and I are not that old, and we did not exist back in these days. And I got a lot of this material from a book from Leonard Johnson, who was working for UW Extension at that time. And I'll show you the cover of that later if you want, if you're interested. With that, I'll just hand it off to Dan for a little recap.
Yeah, thank you, Perry. So if we were kind of just to look back in those early days, you know, the pre-1970s were really a time of nation building, ag production, and resource use, kind of culminating in Earth Day. Management of our predecessors, you know, the soil and water conservation districts were especially successful, I think, using the concept of neighbors helping neighbors. The Soil Conservation Service and UW Extension, which were the agencies that assisted those local elected officials, first introduced some of these institutionalized concepts of soil and water conservation, really set the stage. During those times, we managed the land base based upon its potential and limitations. As you look back through the case files, this is referenced again and again. The main focus was on soil erosion and water quantity, either flood control or drainage. And at that time, there was very limited focus on water quality.
So when water was really introduced big time into the program, of course, started with the Clean Water Act of 1972, where the swimmable, fishable goals were established, water quality standards were adopted at the national and state level. The programs focused on point sources first, upgrading the sewage treatment plants, the industrial discharges, and so forth. But even at that time, everyone recognized that non-point pollution was the leading cause of water quality problems in Wisconsin, to the tune of 75% of our problems. This was when the word water was added to our names, so we became the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. A couple of years later, the Clean Drinking Water Act was adopted at the federal level, which set minimum standards for public water supplies, but by doing so also shine the light on water quality issues for private wells as well. And then that same year, the Wisconsin legislature created Chapter 33, which introduced the lake management programs in the state. So that in particular allowed for planning by watershed, and it really focused on protection of the lakes as a resource. The Washington County project was an interesting event that went on for about 6 years through the 70s. It was a $2 million EPA research project that was focused on that whole non-point issue. What are we going to do to address the other 75% of our water quality issues? It was a tough nut to crack. The EPA was interested in not only figuring out the technical solutions, but also the institutional solutions. And because of that, they set up monitoring stations in Washington County, in the northern part in the agriculture areas and the southern part in the developing areas, and really tried to quantify the non-point issues, and came up with numbers like, 40 times the erosion rates on construction sites than you would get on agricultural fields. Their final report was very critical of the effectiveness of the soil and water conservation districts and SCS because of a number of things. The lack of targeting of resources. It was pretty much just set up to take whoever walked into the door and asked for assistance. They pointed out that the soil and water district supervisors really were not setting policy, and they complained a lot about NRCS's focus on drainage, like Dan mentioned. I know when Dan and I both started, this was still going on. There was a lot of agricultural drainage work going on. And they also pointed out that SCS, or I keep using those interchangeably, NRCS, had no interest or authority in non-point regulation as an agency, but even legal-wise. And also institutionally, a state cannot mandate any kind of a program or have the federal agency administer a state grant. So those were a lot of institutional obstacles to what they were trying to do. In the mid 70s, the state board created the county conservationist position. It was pretty much a new idea. It was catching on around the country. Of course, in Wisconsin, it was a little different. They actually had the staff hired by the county, and then they worked for the Soil and Water District. So you became a liaison between the state agencies and the county board, but you still worked for the conservation districts. Our jobs were to coordinate program efforts, administer grants, and to grow the program. They offered a whopping $5,000 per year to hire a county con. Of course, you could hire a good county con back then for about $4 an hour, so it wasn't such a bad deal. They also offered $3,600 per county for landowner cost sharing, which again doesn't sound like a lot, but you know, it was a foot in the door, and it was appreciated at the county level. The state program started to grow at that time. 1977 was the first of them, where DADCAP created the Farmland Preservation Program. And this was all before you had use value assessment. So farmland was being taxed. A huge issue in your urbanizing areas because basically farmers were getting taxed off their land. So primary goal was tax relief, but it was also this three-pronged thing where you're preserving prime farmland through zoning or land use agreements, and then it also had a soil conservation component. To this day, I say that this has been the most complicated program we have worked with. A lot of the counties were involved in actually doing the farmland preservation plans as well. But we were primarily focusing on administering the conservation requirements. Shortly thereafter, literally the next year, the state created the Nonpoint Pollution Abatement Program, or what we called the Priority Watershed Program. It was the first in the nation. Wisconsin was really a leader at that time. And it had a lot to do with that Washington County project, where they were studying the Nonpoint issue and working on institutional solutions. And this was a big part of that solution. The way they funded it right out of the chute was to reallocate those $3,600 grants that were offered to all the counties and to target it to just these priority watershed areas. And it was interesting because this became one of the first of many debates between targeting resources and just allocating them equally across the state. And it caused some pushback from some of the counties. The role of the Soil and Water District in the Nonpoint program was applying for the grants, doing landowner contacts and field inventories, and pretty much implementing the plan. The 100% staff funding came a little later. At first it was work product related, but the state was really asking the districts to implement all three legs of the stool, so to speak: the education, the technical assistance, and the cost sharing. And then SCS was subcontracted through some of the districts to carry out some of this work.
So to recap, the 1970s were really an interesting time. It was a time of federal mandates and state legislative action for clean water. So the leadership and expectations from the federal government in the 70s set an expectation on the states to start addressing water. The Federal Clean Water Act set the original fishable, swimmable goals and mandates in Wisconsin and other states to control water pollution. The 1970s were the time when the Cuyahoga River started on fire, right before that. State legislators needed to amend their platforms for land use and non-point pollution control. In Wisconsin, our state legislature set up the Farmland Preservation Program under Chapter 91. It set up the Nonpoint Pollution Control Program under Wisconsin Stats 281, and it set up the Inland Lake Protection and Rehabilitation Programs under Wisconsin Stats 33. Importantly, as Perry noted via the Washington County project, which ironically he had a chance to participate in and witness, the state actually evaluated the capacity of soil water conservation districts to deliver mandatory soil erosion and non-point pollution control programs. And it was at that point where they came to the realization that they had to set up the institutions that we're working under right now.
So by 1980, the County Conservationist idea was taking hold. We had 40 county cons hired at that time, to the point where we actually started to get organized. We formed the Wisconsin Association of District Employees, or WADE. Don Franke from La Crosse County became our first president, if some of you remember Don. And we were really looking to have a seat at the table with the policymakers, because a lot of expectations were being thrown our way, but yet we didn't necessarily have a whole lot of say in how the programs were written. Of course, at this time, Ronald Reagan was elected president. This changed a lot of things at the federal level. The threat or the anticipation that EPA was going to regulate non-point pollution pretty much went away. If anyone's old enough to remember Ronnie Reagan, his motto was that big government was the problem. So he was trying to cut back on government and instituted a hiring freeze and whatnot. So a lot of things were put on hold. So that really created a decision time for Wisconsin. The Washington County project pointed out all the flaws of our institutional system. The legislature decided to do their own audit of the Board of Soil and Water Districts at that time. And the conclusion from that report was either the state should expand their involvement in soil and water conservation problems or eliminate the state board. You know, they were really kind of fish or cut bait. They were proposing to establish a program of mandatory erosion controls similar to the state of Iowa. They wanted to target state funding in the districts where the soil erosion problems were the most severe. So there again, you're getting back at that targeting issue. At the same time, the shoreline and floodplain zoning rule was totally rewritten. They learned a lot in those first 10 years or so of administering it and took some huge steps. So from this, the Land Conservation Committee was born. And this was really a bold move by the state, and remains a bold move because we're the only one in the country who ended up eliminating soil and water conservation districts. Chapter 92 was rewritten significantly at that time and mandated that land conservation committees were created in every county, and they were an arm of the county board. So the districts or the county conservationists and any other staff that they hired became staff of the counties and land conservation departments. We also replaced the Board of Soil and Water Conservation with what's the Land Conservation Board. The word water was added into their name later in the 90s. And it was attached to DACCAP instead of UW Extension. The county conservationist agreements were updated. They were now offering $12,000 a year at 50%. They were now requiring college degrees. So things were happening, changes were being instituted, and lo and behold, this is when these two handsome dudes were hired. 1983, both of us came on board. I was in Washington County at the time, where they apparently couldn't afford color film. And then in Chippewa County, I think they were wondering whether they really should have color film after that crazy hat dams were in there. So why land conservation committees? The legislature really wanted to delegate local control to the counties. In Wisconsin, counties had and still have a reputation of clean government. This was not the case nationwide, and it was actually one of the key reasons why districts were set up as independent units of government originally. But in Wisconsin, we were trying to get away from that. The district was considered a stepchild agency. They weren't state, they weren't federal, they weren't county. They were just kind of hanging out there. They didn't belong to anybody. So this solved that. County government in particular. It also allowed the program to be tapped into some additional revenue source in the form of property taxes, something the districts didn't really have access to, and the whole array of support services that come at the county level, such as HR and finance and purchasing, and even technology support was huge. The state can now offer grants to the counties and can mandate things. In fact, when Chapter 92 was rewritten, there were some mandates in there, which I'll get to in a second. The county could administer the state grant instead of the SCS. And getting at that whole regulatory component, the county board has the authority to adopt and enforce a Nonpoint ordinance, and they actually have legal counsel to help provide that support services behind it. They updated the referendum statute in 9211 at that time. Previous to this, it required a 2/3 majority vote through every town through a referendum process to adopt a Nonpoint ordinance. Now they changed it to just be a majority vote. So you could tell what their thinking was. They still had that bit of an institutional obstacle to jump over, but it was reduced somewhat. So after land conservation committees were created, it began a decade of significant program growth for the land conservation organizations. And the first part required us to rename our organizations. And the 30-year-old Wisconsin Association of Soil and Water Districts became WLWCA or WLCA. We added the water later in the 90s. And WALS was created from the previous WADE, which was only actually 3 years old. So at this point in time, we had two associations, one for the committees and one for the staff. About a year after that, a bill was pushed through the legislature by the city of Milwaukee that created a regulatory process for sediment control, and I'll cover the animal waste version of that as well. And it also, for the first time in the state's history, mandated a watershed project for the Milwaukee River. And that is because the city was under a $2 billion mandate from DNR to clean up their combined sewer system downtown. And they were concerned that even after they spent all that money, because most of the water pollution is still coming from upstream, that it needed to be some kind of a mandatory program upstream. So they mandated a voluntary program, essentially. And it covered 7 counties at that time, the watershed, well, it still does. But the program required one county to take the lead, or they called it lead designated management agency. Since nobody was really anxious to do that under a mandated system, the state association actually stepped up. At that time, it was the president happened to be from Waukesha County, Joellen Mulder, and she really wanted to get an executive director position created. And this was a great opportunity to do that. So she was suggesting that the WLCA create this position, and then they take the lead on the Milwaukee Watershed project. And they did creating the position, but they did not get involved in the Milwaukee Watershed project. So just kind of an interesting twist. The animal waste programs also started to grow considerably. The first one out of the chute was NR 243, which covered both the confined animal feed operations, which are actually pretty farms, just didn't exist very much in the state. So what got more attention in the rule was the complaint-based system. And this created more friction between DNR and DATCAP than anything. And by the time they worked out their differences, they split up the program so that DATCAP would provide the cost sharing and DNR would cover the regulatory component of it. And that's still in place today. And of course, the counties end up doing all the work anyways, administering the grant and the technical assistance. At the same time, DNR also rolled out a new animal waste management program that they called the Farmers Fund. It was a voluntary program for the counties, but it required you to do a county-wide animal waste management plan to deal with barnyard runoff primarily, and manure storage was also part of it. And then once you had a plan, you could apply for additional implementation grants as well. But as part of that program, it also required the county to adopt a manure storage ordinance. So this was kind of the first step in that process of mandating local regulations in order to deal with the Nonpoint problem. And of course, at the same time, the DNR's Priority Watershed Program was still one of the biggest cost-sharing programs around for animal waste management. So that continued as well. On the soil erosion control side, when they rewrote Chapter 92, they built in a state mandate that every county was required to prepare a soil erosion control plan. And then they created a goal in the statutes that all individual fields would meet T value by the year 2000. And it became the motto of the program, T by 2000. The program offered cost sharing grants as well as staffing grants to counties. Also in this year, the Farm Bill for the first time ever included soil conservation compliance, which really changed the mission of SCS to be a cross-compliance agency rather than just a technical assistance agency. And an interesting note on that is it also included a swamp buster provision, which stopped the draining of agricultural or wetland areas to create agricultural land, which was still ongoing. And interestingly, this provision was written by a Republican Senator, Bob Caston, from the state of Wisconsin. Also, about a year later, the state updated the erosion control requirements for the Farmland Preservation Program and required every county to adopt erosion control standards. And at this time, erosion control standards were minimum standards at the state level. They said at a minimum you have to get to T on each field, but it allowed the counties to be more aggressive, especially in areas of gully erosion and whatnot. And it was also at this time that a little bit of debate, I'll call it, occurred between SCS and the counties, because right after the state adopted this T standard in statute, SCS invented what they called alternative systems, which was pretty much a way to get around meeting T but still staying in the farm programs, so to avoid non-compliance issues. So it was very controversial at the time and resulted in lots of resolutions and whatnot. So, and again, the Priority Watershed Program was no slacker in this sediment or soil erosion control, but they were really focusing on not just erosion control, but sediment delivery as well. And they were creating models to figure out how much of the erosion ended up in the water resource. So that DNR and DADCAP tension that I mentioned earlier through NR 243 kind of kept growing as their programs overlapped between the Farmers Fund and the Priority Watershed Program and ADCAP or Ag 160. They had different rules and they were poorly coordinated. The cost sharing rates were different. And it became a problem when you're at the county level because you could literally be on a farm where they might be eligible for a couple different programs, but they had all these different rules and rates, and it was quite confusing. And the landowners and the counties got caught in the middle. So the legislature and the governor got involved at this point and really forced the agencies to the table. The governor actually proposed to transfer the Nonpoint program to DADCAP, but as a compromise, they rewrote their rules at the time. And in fact, our first executive director took the lead on that rulemaking process, and counties really led the rulemaking process. And also part of that solution to that debate was that DADCAP was assigned the lead role in the agricultural portion of Priority Watershed programs. They actually transferred 3 DNR staff positions from DNR to DADCAP. So at this time, I would say on our roller coaster ride, we were thinking counties rock. We were on a roll. The programs, everybody was looking to us to take leadership. And when we were offered that leadership, we proposed solutions to coordination of the programs, and things were going our way. So some other things that were happening water related was the amendment to the Federal Clean Water Act in 1987, which introduced the WPDS permits, or really started that chain of events that led to a robust stormwater program in the state. And it also started the whole 303D list, where the state was required to report any water bodies that were not meeting the clean water standards. And then total maximum daily loads plans became a mandate for those 303D waters. So that's where that all came from. A couple of years later, the Lower Wisconsin River Waterway legislation was passed. The Stewardship Fund was created. I believe it was started out as a tax on cigarettes. A legislative audit, another one occurred. That was one of the results of that redesign back in the 87 period. They said, we'll rewrite the rules, but then we're going to audit the program every couple of years to see how it's going. In the first audit, they were still very critical of DNR's management of Nonpoint programs, funds. I won't get into how they budgeted, but it was a real difference between DNR and DADCAP on how program budgets, and they ended up losing $3 million because of it. And they were also critical of the effectiveness of the program and the DNR assessment methods, as in measuring progress in water quality. Also this year, which was a big deal statewide actually, was the Milwaukee Journal ran a 6-day front page series that they called Ill Waters. And it really shined the light on the ineffectiveness of state water quality programs. They did point out the progress that was made, but they focused on the lack of enforcement on the worst Nonpoint sites in particular. I'll turn over to Dan.
In 1990, you can probably explain this as a time of real institutional reform with state legislative support. The county land conservation committees were created to replace the SWCDs, and the state adopted a carrot and stick approach that is really still with us. We had the voluntary program platform that was intended to be implemented via the land conservation committees in coordination with the state and federal programs. Through that, there were erosion control planning and technical assistance grants that were made available through the counties, and the priority watershed planning and technical assistance grants were set up to start focusing on the water quality side. I think it's important to note that at this time, we were working very closely in consort with our federal agency partners, the Soil Conservation Service, as they continued to implement their federal conservation programs using the voluntary approach. And it was a time when there was a little bit of identity building in the county offices, as we were still kind of co-located in most cases, shared files, and we're working concurrently with our federal partners. At the same time, though, the state was setting up the regulatory platform. You can see the stick there in the graphic. And that's when the Urban Stormwater Program was set up. That's when the state set up its agricultural livestock facility regulations under CAFOs through the WPDS process, and then the small CAFO program or complaint-based program. And you'll recall there was a segregation of duties with the DNR taking the lead regulatory role, and the DATCAP and counties expected to provide cost share and technical assistance through a complaint-based process. There was quite a bit of push and pull between DNR and DATCAP on the appropriate balance between the funding of the voluntary and regulatory programs. And again, in 1985, it was also time for reform with the USDA, where for the first time federal cross compliance was established, establishing USDA standards for both erosion control and wetland drainage. And as a consequence of that, there was some inconsistency between the state program standards and the federal standards and expectations. At this point, what we'd kind of like to do is take a quick break, maybe for 5 minutes or so, with questions that we would ask Penny to facilitate. And we've got another break for questions in another about half hour out or so. So we've covered a lot of material, and think that it would be appropriate to break things up if you have questions through Penny.
Okay. Well, we have a couple coming in. So the first question was, so was FPP prior to the USDA National Voluntary Program of T by 2000?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Penny.
Was FPP prior to the USDA National Voluntary Program of T by 2000? Do you know?
Was farmland preservation
Prior to the USDA National Voluntary Program of T by 2000. You stumped him, Kurt.
T by 2000 was rolled out in 1984. The Farmland Preservation Program was created in 77. The standards between the program were a little different. They basically became merged in the late 80s, if that's what the question is. Like that.
Yeah, he went on to say, did the National Initiative T by 2000 in 1984-85 have any effect to any changes in Wisconsin?
I think if I recall, the T by 2000 initiative was the original goal that was set as DATCAP set up the erosion control program. And that goal was established before before the federal cross compliance requirement of the 1985 Farm Bill was established. And that led to the debate as to how the counties could possibly achieve the T by 2000 goal if the federal standard provided alternative systems that would not require T. So that resulted in kind of a disconnect between the county's conservation planning efforts that were going on through its service delivery and the USDA's conservation planning option for alternative systems. I recall that the district conservationists at the time, who were the SCS employees, were also very troubled by that because they were, as a profession, very interested in the T by 2000 goal, but really didn't have an option but to offer it to their producers.
And then I see down a little bit later, Kurt had added one of the original drafts of the conservation compliance provision of the 1985 Farm Bill was for HEL, or that's highly erodible, I think, fields to be farmed to T. Farmers in many states were up in arms and said they couldn't do it. Next draft, which was passed, was that HEL fields needed to be farmed to 2T.
Yeah, that's that alternative systems that I was referring to. Just to be clear, the T by 2000 was a state goal. It was not a national goal. And that NRCS, it came from NRCS. The T value is published by NRCS. But like he says here, it was difficult transition for some of the farmers to get to that T, and the alternative systems allowed them to kind of get there over time.
Penny, if I might add, first of all, Kurt, thanks for chiming in, and anyone else that can share the history, we appreciate that. I think an important point to note was, as part of the T by 2000 goal, there was a mandate from DATCAP for counties to develop county-wide erosion control plans. That was the county's first charge by the legislature through DATCAP to institute an erosion control program. And counties were obligated to inventory the farms and come up with estimates of erosion, and then come up with policies and programs that they would use to seek to achieve that T by 2000 goal.
All right. So getting back to that front page article by the Milwaukee Journal, or the 6 days of Milwaukee Journal front page articles, the state legislature really paid attention to that. And because of it, one of the young senators at that time, Senator Chuck Qualla, formed a Legislative Council Special Committee on Nonpoint pollution. And his goal was to address the issue of the effectiveness of the Nonpoint program. Some of the things that came out of this bill, it was the committees met around the state and did hearings and whatnot, and about a half a dozen different bills came out of it. One of them was that all the watersheds in the state were to be selected by the year 2000. So not only did we have T by 2000, now we had all priority watershed selection by year 2000. It helped fund the program by creating a new vehicle title transfer fee, which generated about $8 to $9 million per year for the Nonpoint program. At the time, NRCS was really struggling with supporting all of our programs through their engineering certification. So the state created a parallel system through DATCAP, which is still in place today. It also created 8 new DATCAP engineers at the time to help provide more technical assistance for the Nonpoint program. DATCAP rolled out what they called the Shoreland Management Ordinance program, which was designed to encourage buffers along streams. There were some urban components as well. It mandated 1 and 2 family erosion control be incorporated into the state building code. At first, it mandated that every county in the state also adopt a construction erosion control ordinance, but that was vetoed by the governor. And really, the primary component of the bill was also vetoed by the governor, which was referred to as the bad actor. And what it required was that the worst non-point sites in each priority watershed projects needed to get fixed. And if the landowner did not do it voluntarily, then there would be a regulatory follow-up to that program. But this was vetoed at the time. It created a lot of discussions among the state associations on how to deal with the legislative activity that was going on. And that was when Walsh created our legislative committee, and then we updated our bylaws. The following year, the next in the series of non-point audits was conducted, and it was still very critical of how DNR was budgeting and projecting their future needs in the program. And it was still very critical for that same point, that we didn't have a regulation for those worst sites. Shortly after this, the largest waterborne disease outbreak in U.S. history occurred through the water supply, the public water supply in the city of Milwaukee. This was in the spring of 1983. We had a series of storm events in the Milwaukee River watershed in April, and it created a lot of flooding and combined sewer overflows down in the city. By now they had the deep tunnel project online, but even after $2 billion, the entire system was designed to handle a 1.5 year storm. So there was a lot of overflows, and 400,000 people got very sick from a contaminated water supply with cryptosporidium in it. 69 people died. A lot of them were AIDS patients or somebody with some kind of a underlying disease. And it was initially blamed, the entire contamination was blamed on upstream animal waste problems in the Milwaukee River. And at the time I was working upstream, and it was very odd because it was like, by 1993, we'd been working and actually had reduced a lot of animal waste runoff through the priority watershed program. So there was certainly nothing new in the water from animal waste. But it did lead to much attention to the non-point program at the state level and the need for regulation. A little footnote here, many years later, through additional research on the cryptosporidium, it actually was determined to be more of a human waste issue. And because the cryptosporidium would get into the sewer system and they were having combined sewer overflows, the water intakes in the lake were basically recycling some of that back into their water supply. So, but what was amazing out of this outbreak, which was just, to this day, it's the worst in the nation, if you look it up. Within 3 months, the legislature adopted critical sites legislation, which was essentially the same thing as the governor just vetoed out of the 91 bill, and they called it the bad actor. Now it was called the critical sites. So it required the worst sites in a watershed to be subject to a regulatory follow-up. It also set the Land Conservation Board up to oversee the non-point program and the bonding authority, because there was a lot of concern with the level of bonding that was occurring through the program at the time. Well, this slide is kind of a hodgepodge of acronyms, but in the mid-90s, a lot of other things were going on. Yet another legislative audit came out in '94, where they really focused on delegating watershed planning activities to counties because of this mandate to get all the priority watersheds selected by the year 2000. and the fact that it would take 3 to 4 or 5 years to write a watershed plan, there was just a lot of concern, both from the counties and from the state level, that we needed to find a faster way to get the planning process done. So they're proposing to delegate more to the counties. And they're also proposing to target NR 243 investigations to high priority barnyards. This was something that DNR promised not to do when NR 243 was rolled out in '84. And now the Legislative Audit is actually proposing that that be changed as a policy. Because of all this going on with the water contamination in Milwaukee, the governor set up an animal waste advisory committee, and this was in response to the crypto outbreak, the '94 audit, as well as a lawsuit by a nonprofit that was trying to force the state to reduce the CAFO limit from 1,000 animal units to, I think it was 300. Don't quote me on that. But the committee met for months on end. We had 2 representatives on that committee. I forgot to mention that I also served on the Nonpoint committee back in '91. This time around, Bill Schuster from Door County and Don Franke from La Crosse were part of the Animal Waste Advisory Committee. One of the main things they came up with was called the 4 Prohibitions. And Franke used to refer to them as the 4 stupid things you should not do with manure. This was one of the components of the program, and it really focused on implementing an animal waste targeted program with these 4 prohibitions at the county level through county ordinances. At the time, Walsh proposed to reorganize some of the state regulations into one regulation for Nonpoint, which didn't get much traction, but I still think it was a good idea. In '96 is when the Wisconsin Standards Oversight Council was created, where we got the state and federal agencies to coordinate and unify one set of technical standards. Looking back in my 37 years, I'll tell you, this is one of my proudest things to be worked on over the years, was the Standards Oversight Council. And at the same time, the Farm Bill creates the EQIP program. And this was another game changer for NRCS, in that now they were in the business of providing cost sharing. That was always reserved for their sister agency, FSA they called it at this time, after they reorganized in '93. But EQIP was a big deal for NRCS to take on. So just for context, the Priority Watershed Program, in its 20-year history, ended up selecting about 86 priority watershed projects, which I believe was only 43% of the slated projects. 27 of them included the critical sites provisions that we talked about coming out of the legislature. And over this entire period, so you have a pretty good program history of cost sharing, where they spent $200 billion on the program. 60% of that went to landowner cost sharing, and 40% of that went to technical, educational, and administrative services at the county level. And I mention this because it comes into play later when they're redesigning the program. But because of the delay in the planning process and a little bit of micromanagement from the state level, there was some concern at the counties, and the time was ripe for some discussion on redesigning the Nonpoint program. And the first proposal out of the chute came from Representative Mike Powers, who actually used to be the county conservationist in, I believe it was Greene County. And the Republican Party kind of put him front and center to propose some solutions. And it was an odd thing because he didn't work with counties at all. he proposed to end the Watershed program and enforce the 4 prohibitions for animal waste through the shoreland zoning. He wanted to increase the base allocation to all counties so everyone got the same. I think it was like $100,000 or something. And he wanted to end the engineering certification program, which we just created, you know, from the 91 Nonpoint bill. So that was odd. The counties objected to this proposal, the agencies objected to the proposal, and it ended up dying. But it wouldn't go away, because in '96, the DNR was projecting an $18 million shortfall in the priority watershed program and went back to the Land and Water Conservation Board to approve some additional bonding. But by this time, because of all these previous legislative audits, there was a lot of distrust in DNR's fiscal projections. And the Land and Water Board rejected their request for the bonding and told DNR and DATCAP to go back to the drawing board and try to redesign the Nonpoint program for the next budget cycle. The agencies did so, and they came back with a proposal which I won't get into the details. I call it tweaking the rules and adding the Animal Waste Advisory Committee 4 prohibitions. The county saw this as a major opportunity, so we ended up putting together our own proposal where the state would adopt minimum state non-point pollution performance standards and require each county to, instead of doing the erosion control plans that were currently in the statutes, we would propose to change that to land and water resource management plans to encompass both all of the resource concerns, including the Nonpoint program. We presented this to the Land and Water Conservation Board, and it was embraced by the board and recommended to the governor. So the basic framework of our proposal was to work with the existing area-wide water quality management planning process under DNR basin teams, merge that with the Nonpoint performance standards, both for urban and rural areas, and then incorporate them into a county-wide planning process through a revised version of Chapter 92, and then use all the existing programs as tools to implement the land and water plan. And you'll notice the priority watersheds are still there. We considered that a tool in the toolbox. And then as a follow-up, because of that issue of getting at those worst sites, we would still propose a voluntary phase to all the programs first, but to have a regulatory framework built into local ordinances that would address those worst cases. And this graphic that you see right here was actually on a big poster board, and our executive director, Adam Payne, and myself and Dale Shaver actually walked around the Capitol with this, going from door to door, trying to sell legislators on this proposal. At the same time, DATCAP was actually testifying to the Assembly Natural Resource Committee on how they viewed county non-point regulations. They were proposing that counties be delegated with full enforcement authority for local ordinances, that we be encouraged through grant incentives to adopt these ordinances, and we'd be given a 2-year period to adopt them, and then cost sharing would be available for a certain time period. They used 5 years as an example, and then cost sharing would be taken off the table, and there would be a regulatory follow-up to the program, except in cases of financial hardship. So this was the directive that we were getting both from DNR to DATCAP and the legislature at this time. So the Nonpoint program redesign really got going in '97, which unfortunately in February of '97 is right when the Nonpoint section chief was caught in a car accident up in Minnesota. Her and her husband both passed away, leaving 3 kids behind. Her name was Becky Wallace, if any of you remember. great gal to work with, and it was just an unbelievably unfortunate timing of this event, not only for the programs, but for her family as well. It created this vacuum or void in the DNR right when the redesign of the program was charging ahead. And the Senator Burke and Representative Johnsrud were actually leading the charge in putting together a Nonpoint proposal into the 97 budget bill. So we're talking February, March, April, May of 97 is when all this is happening. And it ended up becoming law. Our proposal to add Nonpoint performance standards became law. The Land+Water plans became law. The backsliding a little bit occurred because we lost our vehicle title transfer fee to DOT. They replaced it with GPR funding, which we all know is subject to a lot of fluctuations over time. And we also ended up getting a cut in our program funding for conservation staff by 10%. But we took it as a win because it began this process and we were down a path that we were proposing to begin with. An odd process, I'll tell you. DATCAP and DNR created a 20-member oversight advisory committee that created several functional work groups. We pretty much called them dysfunctional work groups because they did a lot of disagreeing both through the advisory committee and their work groups. They met through 98 and 99 and ended up closing the whole process with little resolution on a number of the major issues. This, in turn, sent DNR and DATCAP back to their little cubbies to work on their administrative rules, and clearly rather independently as well. And much conflict followed. In the meantime, though, we had the big win from the 97 budget bill. We also, as counties, proposed some suggested changes on the minimum requirements for land and water plans and some joint grants and reporting through DATCAP and DNR. We were trying to really force a coordination among the agencies. Both of those became law in the 99 budget bill at the county's request. At DATCAP's request, they also transferred $6 million from DNR to DATCAP to support a base allocation to counties. This addressed that whole issue of when you're in a priority watershed program, you were kind of floating in grant money, but when you were not, you were starving. So we were trying to level some of that out in the redesign of the program. And this was DATCAP's way of doing that, was to offer an average of 3 staff per county at the 170/50 rate. So that's where that came from, as well as offering $100,000 per county for cost sharing. The first one, the 170/50, they were able to fund right out of the chute. We never did see the 100,000 per county. The priority watershed program was pretty much terminated in the 99 budget bill. It started a 10-year phase-out period, and it created a new targeted runoff management program, or TRIM, that we know today. At the time, we didn't think this was a big deal. We thought TRIM would be the new Redesign Nonpoint program. At this time, we also lost our executive director in the middle of this redesign project, and at that time we hired our first professional lobbyist for the association to help us kind of get through that transition, because there was a lot going on with the Nonpoint program. Here's a picture of a couple of the leaders that I was talking about. On the left is Senator Brian Burke. In the middle is Adam Payne, our executive director during that period. And then Senator Chuckwalla was the one who led the 91 Nonpoint bill, and he also was the Senate leader in the 97 and 99 budget bill process. So as far as the conservation roller coaster, we were on a high. We were celebrating. We had land and water plans. We had minimum Nonpoint performance standards written into law. We were on a roll.
So in recap, the 1990 to 2000 period was a time of significant program growth and, very importantly, the establishment of performance standards, because up till now, there were no minimum expectations for performance standards. The state legislature increased funding and expanded the pollution control efforts via the Priority Watershed Program, particularly in the early part of that decade. The LCCs really did step up and accepted program responsibility. They staffed up to provide cost sharing and technical assistance to willing producers. But about the middle to end of the decade, concerns began to be expressed regarding the rising program costs, whether the priority watershed projects were being equally distributed, and whether they were effective in meeting the water quality objectives without targeted regulation. So that was the points of concern that led to the reform. The legislator capped and then cut funding, and on the regulatory side, the state ag performance standards are proposed, and this was done to clarify the minimum expectation of all producers and to provide a basis for regulatory compliance that would be achieved through county ordinances. And importantly, I think Wisconsin remains one of the only states that has these performance standards as a foundation of its Nonpoint program. The state legislature adopted the new Nonpoint redesign that Perry referenced with his graphic to implement the standards through the land and water plans and the various state programs that were provided. And it established the staffing grant formula for the LCCs that would provide stable funding to allow them to pursue this new responsibility.
And then during the rulemaking process, something changes. We were on this clear path, we thought. And in 2000, the counties were really trying to help with this Nonpoint program redesign. And since the agencies were struggling with how to implement the program, we proposed something that we called the designated local program. And it really, it provided incentives to counties to implement the performance standards with we listed a whole number of components that you would need to demonstrate. And then one of them was adopting an ordinance to implement the standards if needed. We presented this proposal to, at this point, was a new DATCAP secretary. And the response was, it was too heavy-handed. And he just flat out rejected it. And we thought, wow, we thought that's what you guys were proposing for the last 10 years, basically. DNR embraced our proposal and incorporated some of the concepts into their TRIM grant scoring criteria, but none of it was incorporated into ADCAP 50 at that time. At the same time, a new magazine came on board called On Common Ground. And one of the articles in it was on the Nonpoint program redesign. And one of the quotes that stuck out to us was that one of the biggest threats to agriculture in Wisconsin is local ordinances. And the article was a joint interview between Farm Bureau and the new DATCAP secretary. So clearly something had changed. Shortly thereafter, in 2001, Governor Thompson resigns to join President Bush's team as the HHS secretary. A big caucus, legislative caucus scandal erupted in Madison, and the two leaders that we looked at earlier, Qualla and Burke, both ended up resigning and going to court over it. I'm not sure exactly whatever happened to them, but they were in big trouble because it sounds pretty benign in today's standards, but they were caught using caucus staff to help with campaigning, and that was the big deal. And of course, by the end of the year, the 9/11 attacks occurred, which really changed the focus of the country, not to mention the state, and then a recession followed. So it became pretty hard to get people to spend any energy on the Nonpoint program redesign. But nevertheless, the rules plowed ahead. Draft rules were released. AdCap 50 was just outright hostile to counties. Counties objected to it and tried to push back. Normally, as you saw in previous slides, we were involved in the rulemaking processes. That was not the case this time around. We were never allowed to see drafts. In 2002, the final rule package was released for hearings. It contained 8 new or revised administrative rules totaling 450 pages. Now keep in mind, these would just show up on your desk, this 450-page document, like every few months, it seemed like. And it was just impossible to absorb. DNR and DACAP went to public hearings separately, so there was no coordination of the hearing dates, a very fast timeline. NR 151 contained the urban and agricultural non-point performance standards, which we supported, but we just kept pointing out that it was missing buffers. Buffers became such a hot button issue that it was removed from the package. On the urban side, the DNR was going to implement the non-point performance standards through discharge permits to communities. On the ag side, AdCap 50, the opposition was just vehement from the counties. And it was the first time I ever saw, we got together for a county conservationist meeting, and every county con in the meeting signed a resolution objecting to AdCap 50. And some of the reasons are listed below. It had no goals, no priorities, no incentives to implement the non-point program, no targeting of funding. It restricted local enforcement instead of encouraging it. It instituted new cost-sharing mandates. It had a cost estimate of $1 billion, and that was using an 11-to-1 cost share to staff ratio, even though we had this 20-year history of a 60-40 split between those two. So, and there was no technical standards process, which was actually mandated in the statutes. So the list was long, the process was bizarre. As far as the conservation roller coaster, it felt like we just went through a backflip and we're trying to figure out what just happened. That was not what we were expecting to come out of the non-point program redesign. But the process was over and the rules became law in 2002. We thought this might be a good time to just take a break and answer any questions that might.
Penny, as we open it up to questions, I note that we got about a half hour left. And I think if we could reserve this to just a couple, perhaps we can try to get to the rest of it at the end. But we're just given the clock, we'll probably have to keep rolling here. Otherwise, we might move into the brown bag lunch portion for those that want to consider tolerating this history.
Right. There's really no questions. Kurt had offered some more information. So why don't you guys just take a breath and continue on? Okay? Let's just.
Terry, I'll dish it back to you.
All right. Well, this began what we call the working with what we got phase. So it wasn't what we were expecting, but on the agricultural side, we had, a series of agricultural non-point performance standards that are now law. The 4 prohibitions were included in that. These are the 4 stupid things you shouldn't do with manure that Frankie was talking about. So most of you will be familiar with these, so I won't go over them. There was a similar set of standards that were adopted for the urban areas, which I also won't go over. will say that the urban part of the program actually started to take off. The 2002 Walsh Annual Conference, which we had been doing for about 15 years at this point, the theme for that conference was called Surviving the Chaos. So that just shows you what the mood was at the time. The following year, we took another $1 million cut in staff funding. It was easy for them to do because they were at that time meeting the 170/50 average 3 per county standard that DACAP had set in their rule, actually in the law, in Chapter 92. Originally was the farmland preservation was proposed to be eliminated during that budget bill, but it was vetoed by the governor. Walsh rewrote our bylaws that year that created a 3-committee structure in kind of a guiding principles section. 2004 saw the Stormwater Program advance considerably through the adoption of NR 216, like I mentioned earlier, which kind of rolled in those urban non-point standards into MS4 permits for the urban areas. Also at this time, there was a lot of frustration with our current executive director at the WLWCA. And there was a proposal from the Western Area Association to merge county cons with the WLWCA, which went on the floor for a vote at their annual meeting and actually passed, or actually got 60% favorable votes, but because it didn't receive 66.7%, it failed, and the motion was declined. The result of that was that county staff were kind of written out of the WLWCA bylaws at the time. So the little animosity between staff and the committees during this process. 2005, as part of the Nonpoint redesign, they took the buffers out of the standards and funded a buffer initiative for 3 years through extension. And they completed their final report, which presented no buffer performance standards. So that was kind of an odd thing. At that time, the counties were promoting the Year of Land and Water Conservation. And we prepared a white paper and a PowerPoint presentation. We were sponsoring legislative bus tours and meetings around the state. If you've ever seen this document, this was our white paper on trying to reignite a state commitment to funding the implementation of the Nonpoint performance standards. But really this was what we call also the withering on the vine era. In 2006, the legislature imposed levy limits on local governments, which remain in place today. To some point, I know they've been modifying them over the years. This was the year of the livestock sighting law was implemented, which was really designed to make it easier for these CAFO operations to get approvals at the local level. It was really a regulate the regulator effort. And staff funding grants were now $1 million short of that statutory goal of average of 3 per county at 170/50. So you can see time started clicking on that funding shortfall already. In the 2007 state budget, the landfill tip fee was added for the Nonpoint program to make up for some of the lost GPR revenue and the vehicle title transfer fee. Unfortunately, they started diverting staffing grant dollars to nutrient management at the same time. And then 2008, 2009, the Great Recession hit, where it again became very difficult for legislators to put much focus on non-point pollution. In the 09-11 budget, this was when Governor Doyle was still in charge at the governor's office. They were facing a $6.5 billion shortfall Yet they rolled out the Working Lands Initiative. They were able to fund it by lapsing $12 million in CREP funds. He also balanced the budget by diverting a lot of DOT road fund balance, which was a huge controversy and pretty much caused him to not run for re-election after that budget. They also increased the landfill tip fee to support the environmental fund, which went to paying the Nonpoint program debt service. So during this recession, that debt service was switched over to the Nonpoint program and pretty much ate up that environmental fund and really made it difficult for us to support our program and impossible to grow. In 2009, state law was adopted to ban phosphorus in lawn fertilizer and dish soap. So that was a huge win for water quality. And this was also the last year of the Priority Watershed program as they closed out those cost sharing grants to landowners as well as counties. So the phasing of funding county land and water programs was pretty much in full effect by then. At this time, we started seeing a lot of retirements from our first generation of county cons, and I just happen to have a few pictures of Don Franke, Bill Schuster, Dave Appleyard. Several of these, Gene and Joe and Don were all Waltz presidents. Don Hauptman, I included in this photo because he was our liaison since the 80s. And during the Nonpoint program redesign, he was also our spy in DATCAP. So we had a lot of love for Don. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Perry. So if you were to recap that decade from 2000 to 2010, it was a time of small government, deregulation, more citizen involvement, and I think importantly, real local resolve. It was the time when the Tea Party movement was gaining traction at the national level, and we were in transition towards small government and deregulation. It was done largely in reaction, I think, to a number of things, but the 9/11 2000 strike on the World Trade Towers really did have an impact on our country as a whole. And then in the later part of the decade, the Great Recession took hold, and that was a time of both private and public sector downsizing. So during this decade, we also had some institutional reorganization that really redefined roles and responsibilities at the local service delivery system. This is a time when the USDA really decollocated from local courthouses and recollocated to make sure that their state agencies, or their federal agencies rather, were in the same location. This is when ag service centers were established, and both NRCS and FSA were co-located, and in a lot of cases they moved out of courthouses, and there was a break in file sharing between the counties and their federal partners. This was significant in the evolution of our programs. At the local level, there was a trend toward more county administrators and executive frameworks of county government, away from county governing committee forms of county government. And as a result, there were department and committee consolidations that started in the mid 2000s, and in some cases continue today. So this really did affect some of local program service delivery. Importantly, the state programs, money for staff and funding were reduced, and levy caps were imposed. And there were refinements to the state administrative rules that were being made to help clarify how this program redesign would be accomplished and the standards would be implemented. There was a lot of debate that Perry noted, and there was a little bit of disappointment because A number of counties had hoped that we would see more detailed frameworks with deadlines and incentives. But in fact, the program framework that was presented to us was really one that allowed for maximum flexibility for counties that wanted to move forward on their own. But there were really no timeframes or even benchmarks or incentives. So we had established a new program framework that really had no beginning or end, but provided flexibility for counties that really wanted to move forward based upon their perception of local need and their ability to capture local resources to get the job done. Perry, I'll pass it back.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So the next and last decade that we'll cover is 2010 to today. And this decade started with the Walsh and WLWCA merger. And I say third time's the charm because we proposed merging in 2001 and 2005 in different methods, but this time around, we just started from scratch, and a joint committee was formed between the two associations to develop a plan and bylaws. And what Dan was just mentioning, the consolidations and the reductions in land conservation committees and staff at the local level was a real driving force behind this. But another one was to improve our legislative influence. The past decade was a disaster for us at the county level. We lost a lot of funding. We lost a lot of momentum. The Nonpoint program was, you know, I say withering on the vine. So in 2011, the merger was approved by the Wisconsin Land & Water. Their bylaws would be contingent on a Walsh approval of the merger in the following March. Ironically, this time around, the Walsh vote was the weak link in the process because there was a bit of pushback from technical staff that they didn't really want to be merged with the committee members. But in the end, we did get the votes, and we ended up dissolving Walsh and supporting the new bylaws. And looking back 10 years, I think it's been a great success. We hired our first executive director under the new organization, Jimmy Vanderbrook, who worked for DATCAP for many years. And before that, he was a county con for a few years as well. So he had that local view of things and the state view. He was an excellent person to take us through that transition under our new brand of Wisconsin Land & Water. This was the organizational structure that we adopted at the time. It was designed where the board of directors would focus on the institution itself, on Wisconsin Land & Water, and the committees would focus on the various activities. For example, the Legislative Administrative Committee was to take the lead on reviewing any legislative bill, administrative rule updates, and so on. And each of the committees were assigned different duties. And I think it's been working quite well. We went through an update of all the guiding principles for the committees. Also in 2010 was a big rollout of the Phosphorus Rule. And the Nonpoint performance standards were updated as well. This allowed the water quality trading and adaptive management to occur for the sewage treatment plants. And it also updated the TRIM grants to focus on large and small scale, and as well as TMDL projects. The 2011 to 2013 state budget was the first one for our new governor, Walker. Very controversial budget. They were looking at $136 million shortfall in the current end of that biennium and a $3.6 billion budget shortfall in the next biennium. They used those shortfalls as an excuse to do a lot of cuts in a lot of programs. And we endured about a 17% in staffing grants. And one of the scariest parts was that it instituted what they called automatic lapses. In other words, if the state didn't meet their fiscal projection, then additional lapses would automatically happen within each of the agency's budgets. And for DATCAP, that meant staffing grant cuts. This eliminated the conservation easement program in the working lands, so it pretty much cut the working lands program off at its knees. It lowered the MS4 pollutant reduction goals, and it removed collective bargaining rights for most public employees, which was actually the most controversial part. Anyone who was around at that time saw the massive protests down in Madison. Much change going on at that time. Very hard to get anyone's attention on funding land conservation. This graph is something we floated around for years in our legislative efforts. It illustrates how staffing grants have been cut. Even if the dollar amount remained the same, it was funding less and less positions because of inflation over time. So when the Nonpoint program was rolled out in 2001, we were still doing pretty good. But by the time the merger occurred between Walsh and WWCA, we were funding about half as many positions with these state grants and far below the statutory goal that they had established. Now at a $3.4 million gap. And that's using 2017 as a basis. So this has grown since then. So just to reiterate that point, these are the various budget bills that occurred in that period. Each one was the same for us. We were continually fighting to maintain county conservation staff funding. There's been a shortfall since that 2004 period. Legislators became very familiar with our cause and annoyed by our cause. It was, and it introduced some very weird discussions with legislators where they would kind of reflect their annoyance, and we'd respond by saying, how do you think we feel? Every year we're back in here asking for the same darn thing, you know, and each year that shortfall grows. So at this point, the conservation roller coaster really was just a roller coaster of up and down and up and down. And we were thinking, can we get off this ride? But meanwhile, good things were also happening. The phosphorus multi-discharge variance was adopted, which provided some reliable funding around the state for counties from the sewage treatment plants again. Kewaunee County adopted their groundwater protection ordinance, which was a reaction to a very high rate of well contamination. And what they used was that 9211 provision that I mentioned very early in the presentation, where you need to go through a town-by-town referendum process. So they pretty much demonstrated that, yes, you can actually exceed the Nonpoint performance standards, but you have to go through this town referendum process, and you have to call it a public health ordinance, not a, you know, Nonpoint or a animal waste ordinance. In 2017, Jimmy Vandenbroek helped pull together what he called the Food, Land, and Water Conference, where he brought a lot of diverse voices together, trying to agree on a path forward for our conservation programs, given our history of, you know, the funding issues that I just referred to. And in 2018, the DNR adopted their first targeted Nonpoint performance standards for the Silurian bedrock areas in the Northeast. This was exercising one of the provisions in the original law that said, these are the standards for the state, but we reserve the right to adopt targeted standards if the water quality standards are not being met in a certain area. And clearly the groundwater standards were not being met in the Northeast. Oops. As far as county ordinances, because of that lack of incentive through the administrative rules, other than the TRIM program, it's been pretty scattered around the state. I did a quick email survey in this last spring to produce this map, and I think I counted about 10 counties with full non-point performance standards built into their ordinance, and then another 20 that built in the standards in other parts, like manure storage was an example, where if they were getting a manure storage permit, then they were required to meet the other standards as well. So I call those partial coverage. And really the triggers of the ordinances is key when you're adopting any kind of a non-point ordinance. What causes the landowner to do something? Or when does it require some action? Water quality took a front stage, of course, in 2019. Again, well contamination was the big issue, this time in the southwest part of the state, where 42% of the wells were shown to be contaminated in a study. Governor Evers rolled out what he called the Year of Clean Drinking Water and put a number of provisions in the budget bill to support clean water initiatives. Not to be outdone, the Republican legislature recreated their water quality task force to kind of outdo the governor. It's like, oh, fine, dueling water quality issues. That's a first for us in 20 years. And that's clearly what it is. It's the best legislative proposal we have seen in 20 years. It was proposing a $3 million increase in staff funding, trying to get us back to that 170/50 base allocation. It also proposed some additional grants for well and groundwater monitoring, well compensation grants to landowners, a freshwater collaborative, nutrient reduction. You know, there was a lot of things buried in this legislative package. The package unanimously passed the state assembly in the spring of 2020. And when Dan and I were presenting this presentation in March at our annual conference, we thought things were were coming our way. Again, we were on the up slide with our roller coaster. Here comes the good part, we're thinking. And then out of nowhere, we get COVID-19, which shut down the Senate and caused all that bill action that the Assembly did to get negated. Because if they didn't act by a certain date, then the bill gets pretty much sent back to the starting point. And we're thinking, well, maybe not. The roller coaster ride continues. So now we're in the point of trying to revitalize that water quality task force initiative.
I really like your roller coaster focus here. I think it really captures what we're going through. So if you take a look at 2010 to 2020 as a recap, it really was a time of citizen involvement, county innovation, which actually culminated in this legislative action to support water quality. I would look back on this decade as one where maybe the worm turned a little bit. Counties accelerated their water quality monitoring and documented the conditions. The nonprofits and industry engaged, both the environmental nonprofits and the industry nonprofits. And there were collaborative efforts, and then there was also some court challenges as it applied to both groundwater and livestock siting. But also very importantly, counties began to adopt these non-point ordinances that incorporated the NR 51 standards. And it was kind of sporadic at first. It took a lot of courage and leadership, but these counties started to actually incorporate the non-point standards into their ordinances. The legislator established the framework and authority for non-point and point pollution control crediting, seeking new solutions for the funding issue, and importantly, politically, both political parties collaborated to take a hard look at the future of the Nonpoint program by establishing this water quality task force and considering a very significant financial investment in the LCCs, in water quality through the upcoming program budget. And then ironically, as Perry noted, almost within a week or two of the state Senate considering this package, we were dealt an outside blow from a global pandemic and are now needing to respond to that. And the challenge is to determine how we're going to move forward as we get back in the saddle. Just kind of looking ahead as we're closing out our presentation here, where are we really going to go? This is really a time of opportunity for increased performance and accountability to show tangible results. What is the future program direction? And we just threw up a couple concepts with question marks in them on places that we might be going. DNR and Extension have collaborated to conduct a survey to document what counties are doing with their program commitments toward implementing the Nonpoint performance standards. They did an original survey in 2018, and it showed a wide range of approaches from counties that are choosing really to not take a very assertive position to those that are breaking through barriers. We really need to ask ourselves whether we should try to focus on clear water quality objectives that are measurable statewide, that can be used to actually track where we're going and what we've achieved. If we're embarking upon these new initiatives, we really need to be accountable for what we're achieving. Counties really need to think about adopting these ag performance standards and implementing them through these ordinances and tracking cost share and cross compliance. Counties, I think, need to track where farms are being evaluated and where we are in full and partial compliance with the performance standards. And there are other things that we should probably be focusing on as we're intending to move forward in the interest of accountability. For perspective, and these are my closing slides here, and then we can open it up. As we approach change, we need to understand that something will always be limiting. Part of our collective frustration has been that, there's never enough staff hours or skill sets or time or money or good energy to achieve everything that we'd like to do. But we have to focus on what we see as limiting and try to connect the dots with what we have available. And that good energy is very important, because at the county level, as resource professionals, we have the ability to determine how we're going to use the local resources at hand and try to connect the dots and achieve some level of moving forward. So it's important to, for perspective, know what you do as resource professionals is very important. It's critical for the environment and for the community that we serve. And it's important for yourself because, we need to continue to focus on our good mental health and avoid burnout. and do as good a job as we can do to be our best. We are all leaders, and Perry, and my parting shot for you is that you're leaders, and we need you to survive, to carry on the mission. And with that, I think, Perry, you wanted to mention some really good work that Leonard Johnson did, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, if anyone is interested, I think you can actually still order this book online. But Leonard Johnson was one of our advisors in the early days when the land conservation committees were formed. And he worked on the State Board of Soil and Water Conservation for many years. So it covers that from the 30s to the 80s, basically. He does a nice job of summarizing the evolution. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Penny, if there's any other questions or comments, we could even turn the mics on and let people ask that way.
There really aren't any more comments. I did send out the link. I would say since we're running out of time and you guys got it done, which congratulations on that. That's one major accomplishment for the great presentation you gave us. Thank you, Perry and Dan. Great. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.